All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. This is the How to Manage Your Grant webinar for the African American Cultural and Historical Grant Program. So glad you all were able to join us this afternoon. So in today's presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about how to navigate DOS grants. So for most of you, you probably haven't even thought about DOS grants since 2022, so you might need a little refresher course. We're going to talk about the grant award agreement, encumbrance requirements, progress reports, how to request payments, what it means to be in non-compliance, amendments, how to close out your grant, and how to manage effectively. And then, of course, we will have the opportunity for you to ask questions. If you have questions as I'm going through the slides, you can put your questions in the chat box, and then I will circle back at the end and address those questions so that we can keep the webinar going and not interrupt the flow. So a brief grant program overview. Today, I am joined by staff from the Division of Historical Resources. Eric Case is the grant supervisor, and I also see that Alexa Wilson and Olivia Wachowski, and I'm sorry, Olivia, if I pronounced that incorrectly. And then I am Terry Abstein. I'm the financial administrator for the Division of Arts and Culture. So you've all heard from me, and then a couple of the grants that we have in this funding cycle will actually be managed by Historical Resources, and you probably have already heard from the folks over there already. So our grant period for this grant is July 1st, 2024. So last July through June 30th of 2026. So this is new funding that is funded with state dollars. If you'll recall, the original grant that you had applied for was federal funding, and that funding has all been depleted, but the legislature funded some additional grants with the state funds. And that's important because you won't have those federal regulations, and you won't have the time restriction that those federal grants have. So that's a good thing. After the June 30th, 2026, we are able to provide extensions as necessary in 6-month increments. And I'll talk a little bit about how you will ask for an extension later on in the slideshow. So getting started. First thing you're going to want to do is go and revisit your application. I'm sure you have a file. If you didn't have a file, now's the time to make one. You are required by the grant award agreement to have a file and to maintain the project records for 5 years after the grant is closed. And for some reason, if we are audited and your grant is the lucky one to get picked, you would need to provide information to us. And those records that you keep in that file include the grant award agreement, any financial documentation, the deliverable documentation, if you have it on electronic storage, like a thumb drive or an external storage drive, make sure you keep those and that they're in working order. And if you do have multiple grants with the Department of State, be sure that you're keeping separate files for each of your grants. You are going to want to revisit your organization profile and make sure that it's up to date. Make sure your fiscal year is there, that we have the correct address, correct contact information. If you need to update your staff, there is a tab over on the right-hand side at the top that says Manage Staff. You will go in there, see who is listed, If there's someone who's no longer with your organization, you can remove them, you can add staff. And if you have questions about how to do that, there is a frequently asked questions document in DOS grants under help, but also division staff here can help you through that as well. So there are multiple roles for your organization staff members, but primarily it's the organization manager who's able to edit the organization details, add and edit staff, and they're able to view, edit, submit all the items in the grant details. And then viewer, which you basically can only see the organization details, not the grant record details. So if you have someone who's going to be doing reporting for you, or your financial person for the organization is going to be requesting the payments, you're going to want to make sure that they are the organization manager. There are some other roles, but these two are the most useful. So to find your grant in DOS grants, you're going to click on grants in this purple blue ribbon at the top. Click on grants and then go to my grants and it will be listed. Ooh, look at me speeding faster than speed of light. If you don't see it, let us know. We can help you click through the system. There's something else I was going to mention and I've forgotten what it was. I'll come back to it if it occurs to me. So once you click on the grant that's listed under My Grants, you're going to come to the grant record details. You might want to bookmark this page in your browser because this is where you're going to go to request payments, to do your quarterly reports. This is where you're going to go if you need to do an amendment after you talk to division staff. So this is really important. Make sure you book that or you know how to get to it.
Zoom conference. But you can come up here.
Okay, I just muted everyone just so that we all right. So the next thing that is important is the grant award agreement. The grant award agreement is a legally binding document between you as the grantee and the Department of State. And it contains basically everything that you're going to need to know for the requirements for your grant. So in there is going to be the scope of work, the deliverables, and by deliverables we mean what you need to do in order to receive payments, how long the agreement is, what the payment policies are, financial consequences if you don't meet the deliverables, if there are any special conditions, what we mean by encumbrance, the reporting requirements with those deadlines. And the deadlines are also in DOS grants by each report that we populate. So you should never have any question about that, but they are due. And I'll remind you of this again. Reports are due 15 days after the end of every quarter. The grant award agreement also has extension policies and the procurement requirements. So when you are determining your project schedule for how long it's going to take for you to finish, be sure to build in how long it's going to take to finalize your scope of work and your budget, and for us to generate the contract, and for the folks on your end to review it and sign it, and then send it back to us, and for us to execute it. So that will take some time. So build that into your timeline when you're thinking about your project. Once we have received the signed and dated copy of the grant award agreement from you, including all the required documents that goes with it, it can take a week or two for us to get it executed. It depends on if our directors are here, holidays, staff absences. So be sure to keep that in mind. And then once we have executed the grant award agreement, we will provide a copy for your records. And you're always able to access that in DOS grants to download as well. And once it's published in FACTS or the Florida Accountability Contract Tracking System, the contract is there as well. So what do we mean by encumbrance and procurement? So when you are looking for a contractor, an engineer, an architect, any kind of purchasing, it should be as open and competitive for goods and services as you possibly can do. So purchases up to $2,500, get quotes. Purchases between $2,500 and $35,000, you'll need written quotes or written records of telephone quotes, informal bids. Anything above $35,000, you would either need to do a formal invitation to bid, request for proposals, or invitation to negotiate. And before you execute those contracts, we as at the divisions will need to review that to make sure that all of the information that is required is in them and that it is eligible as an expense. So what that would look like, so you are supposed to have a binding contract for all or part of the scope of work in your grant award agreement within 6 months of you executing the agreement. If you need longer than that, request it by email to the person who is managing your grant and explain why you need the extension, when you anticipate having that, and sort of where you are in the process, what your plan is to get it completed. If your project does not involve contract services, we'll talk about that on a case-by-case basis. And then again, note all documentation must be reviewed and approved prior to you executing it. So keep that in mind. You also will need to provide that encumbrance as part of your first deliverable. So the first payment request, you will need to have that to provide to us. So keep that in mind. So what we look for is to make sure that the scope of work that is in your contract with your contractor or your engineer, your architect, is the same scope of work that you have in your grant award agreement, that you have a timeline or a projected completion date, that the costs of the goods and the services in the contract matches what is in the budget in your grant award agreement, that you have a no discrimination clause, which is in section 3 of the grant award agreement. This is the thing that I find with my grantees that is missing most often. If you need to have an example of what that statement looks like, I am happy to share that with you. I have some boilerplate language that you can ask the contractor, architect, engineer to include in the contract. And then also any ground disturbance under special conditions in the grant award agreement would need to be discussed in that contract. Things that are acceptable for documentation for encumbrance, purchase orders, acceptance of vendor proposals, task authorizations, work orders, or a contract or agreement with your contractor, architect, engineer. And we have a note on this slide also, just so you don't forget, those do need to be approved by us before you execute it. Okay, so you have your grant award agreement, it's been executed, and the first quarter after you've done that, you'll have a progress report due. So the progress reports are quarterly. They are submitted in DOS grants. And in those progress reports, we will describe and document what you've done on the project, what expenses you've incurred, what deliverables or work items you may have completed, or what percentage they are complete. And you have the opportunity to add attachments in the progress reports. And that would include things like meeting minutes, encumbrance documentation, deliverable documentation, and photographs. If you do submit photographs, there's a handy link in the slides, which you will be getting a copy of, to the Division of Historical Resources photograph submission guidelines. And if you have incurred expenses, you've spent money towards the grant, update your expenditure log. This is a good time to do it, so that way you're reporting constantly on the project. So you will access the expenditure log from the grant records details page. You'll just click on edit on the right-hand side under expenditure log. And to enter a new expenditure, you'll click add new record and you will enter the new expense. And so we ask for an invoice number. What is the invoice on the payment request from the vendor to you? Transaction number would be the check number that you paid them with, or the electronic funds transfer confirmation number, the credit card confirmation number, something of that nature, so we can match it up with the documentation that you will send us with your payment requests. What date you paid it, who you paid it to, how much the transaction total was for, and then of that total, how much are grant funds. If you do have a required match, then you would indicate if any of that expense is for match or if they are in-kind services. And then which deliverable it goes towards, what budget item it matches up to, and a description. So once you click update on the expenditure that you've done, it is created with the status new, and we are able to see it on our end. So new, you're still able to edit it. Once you submit those new things, you are not able to edit unless we release it back to you. And if we do release it back to you, it will say returned in status for that expenditure in the expenditure log. We do require that when you publicize, advertise, or describe the project, that you include the statement here that says this project is sponsored in part by the Department of State and the state of Florida. And you also are required to install a project sign. And then once you install a project sign with that language, you can also request our logo. You will be required to take a photograph of it installed, and it is part of the deliverables for requesting payments. The sign must be legible, so someone needs to be able to see it from a distance, and it should be durable, so it's going to withstand the weather. And you can use grant funds towards the purchase of the sign. Okay, so you're moving along, you got your project sign installed, and you're ready to request payment. This is how you're going to do that. So again, all of your payments are requested in DOS grants. In order to request a payment, you will have to have completed one or more deliverables and provide that deliverable documentation that's listed in section 1B of your grant award agreement. Those deliverables are also in the contract details form. If you want to do the entire project, pay for it out of your pocket, and then request all the payments at one time when you're finished, you can do that, but do remember that the draft of a contract with an architect or an engineer is required, and it needs to be approved before you move on with your project. So don't wait until you're all finished and go, oh yeah, by the way, here's my contract for you to review. You do need to get us to review that in advance. If you don't have all the documentation, we will return it to you. and ask for revisions. If you aren't able to provide documentation for all expenditures, your payments will be reduced as a financial consequence to match up with what you are able to document. So keep all those receipts and documents. I will mention that the first payment, you have to have that contract in whole or in part of your grant award agreement. So if you're working with multiple contractors and you're doing the electric first, and then you're going to bring someone into the drywall and they're different people, as long as you can demonstrate that you have those contracts and you're working towards the full, that is sufficient. For the remaining deliverables, you will need to provide invoices and checks and bank statements, photographs of your work. So just keep those things in mind as you're moving forward with the grant. This is what the payment request page looks like. Again, accessed from the grant records details page. You're going to select on the left-hand side which deliverable it is that you're requesting payment. The invoice period would be the dates that encompass those expenditures. The end date cannot be a date in the future. The system will give you an error message. The attention field is not me. It's not Eric. It's not Olivia. We aren't getting those checks. We aren't getting those payments. It would be someone in your organization that would be receiving the check if it's a paper check. So attention to someone who the mail will be delivered to, essentially. And this is where you will attach all of your deliverable documentation, the photographs, the invoices, the checks, the bank statements. So there's no place to put that documentation within the expenditure log. We expect to see it in the payment request. And if you've given it to us in a report, you also have to put it in the request for the payment because it needs to be all in one place in the system. Once the payment has been submitted, send us an email, let us know, hey, I've submitted a payment. Can you look at it? Make sure I have everything. Do I need anything? I have questions. Let us know that it's there so that we can look at it. We will review the deliverable and the financial documentation. And if it is approved, we submit the request, finance and accounting for processing. So just a word of warning, that can be a long process for finance and accounting to get it paid. So they review the request. They have to send it to the Department of Financial Services for disbursement. Because this money is fixed capital outlay, there are additional approvals involved. And so I'm going to skip to the bottom bullet first. It can take 8 to 10 weeks. So think about that when you're considering cash flow. Be prepared for that to take a while, just because it has to go from us to them, to someone else, to someone else, to someone else, and then it comes back to us. So it takes a while. Funds are provided either by check or direct deposit. Direct deposit is faster and you're not reliant on the postal service. So there's a link in the slideshow to the direct deposit authorization form so that you can receive your funds electronically. That does take several weeks. It's not managed by us. So if you haven't done that already, I would go ahead and get that started if you want electronic funds. And then you can check on the request on your grant record details page. And once a payment has been vouchered, which means a check or the electronic funds is actually being processed to go out, it will show up in FACTS, that Florida Accounting Information Resource. And the link is here in the slideshow. So if a payment is not approved, it's because you haven't provided us the documentation that we need. or it's the wrong documentation, so it doesn't match up with what is in the expenditure log, or it's incomplete, we need you to revise something, or if they're non-allowable costs, we'll send that back to you as well. Or if you are in non-compliance for some other reason. So if you have not completed your reports with us and we put you in non-compliance, we also can't pay you. So you would need to catch up on your reports. If you have multiple grants with the Department of State, if you're in non-compliance with one of those grants, you're in non-compliance with all of them. So you'll have to make sure that you manage all of your grants in a timely manner. So this is just a reminder about non-allowable expenditures. They're also in the guidelines, which I will resend a copy of because I'm certain that it's been a very long time since you thought of those guidelines. If the work does not comply to Secretary of Interior standards, if that is applicable, if you completed work outside of the grant period, remember, grant period starts July 1st of 2024. You can't pay for food or beverages, awards. This grant does not cover project administration, indirect costs that are not readily identifiable as expenditures for materials and services related to the scope of work. Furniture and equipment that is not approved by the department. It doesn't cover conferences, tuition waivers, travel, etc. So it really should be the construction costs related to your project. All right, so I've said the word non-compliance a couple times. Let me talk to you a little bit about what that is. So if you have not satisfied administrative requirements, you are placed in non-compliance. So that would mean you're not meeting the deadlines for reporting. You haven't submitted the required documentation that we've asked for in a timely manner. You don't respond to our emails. You haven't completed work according to Secretary of the Interior standards, according to the scope of work. And as I mentioned, if you're in non-compliance, that means the whole organization is in non-compliance. So if the city of Hollywood is in non-compliance for an arts and culture grant, and they have an AACH grant too, they're in non-compliance for all of it. If you don't resolve your non-compliance, you might be required to return some or all of the grant award. We might terminate the grant, and your organization might be prohibited from applying for future grants with the Department of State. And that isn't going to happen to anyone because you all are going to turn everything on time and you're going to answer our emails and you're going to be good communicators. I know it. Based on how quickly everyone called me and emailed me when I told them that they had an award. Okay, so amendments. We talked about amendments in the very beginning. You can ask for an amendment. We can reach out to you and say, I think we need to do amendment. Your budget's not lining up, et cetera, et cetera. So either of us can request a modification to the contract details. Those changes are only valid when it's in writing and it's signed by you and by us. And it should be submitted through DOS grants. If an amendment is needed, email us, your program manager, grant manager, before you enter it into DOS grants, so we know what's going on and we can talk it through, make sure we're doing the right thing. Let us know the reason for the amendment, what the proposed changes are, and then it would be entered in DOS grants for us to create that amendment signature. If you need an extension to the completion date, it needs to be requested at least 30 days before the grant period end date. We can only do them in 6-month increments unless you can demonstrate what the extenuating circumstances are. And extenuating circumstances do not include failure to read or understand what the requirements are, not being able to raise sufficient funds, and we do review the requests on a case-by-case basis. So again, let your program know your grant specialist, your grant manager, all those words are kind of interchangeable. The person that you're working with on this grant in the Department of State, that's who you want to reach out to. Let them know what the reason for the request is, if you're requesting an extension, how much time. And if you have documentation to support that request, give that to us as well. We will review it, and if it is approved, we will send you an amendment for signature. Make sure you sign it and date it and send it back to us. And then once we sign it on our end, we will send you a copy of the fully executed amendment. Okay. We're all done with your grant. Now what happens? You've gotten all your payments, you did all your deliverables. Next is closeout. So all expenses must be incurred and the scope of work completed by the grant completion deadline, which is June 30th of 2026, unless you ask for an extension. After the completion deadline, you have 30 days to submit all of your closeout documentation. So the final payment request, all the deliverable documentation, your expenditure log has to be complete and accurate, and a final progress report. All of your financial backup documentation, invoices, canceled checks, sheets, receipts, etc. All of that 30 days after the end of the grant period. So this grant does come with a restrictive covenant requirement. We give you the restrictive covenant. It's not something that you have to come up with on your own. It asks for you to include an attachment or exhibit A, which is a map or a written description of the property description. It does need to be notarized and filed with the county clerk. And we will not pay out that final payment until we have that filed restrictive covenant in our files. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I absolutely know that. So you're going to want to ask questions. And how do I do this effectively? Read your grant award agreement. Everything you need to know is in that document. If there's something you don't understand, reach out to us. We will explain it to you. Make sure you pay attention to your deadlines. Review all the procurement requirements. If you have a historic property and you are required to adhere to Secretary of the Interior standards, hire a historic preservation professional. They know what they're doing. They will help you manage that. Ensure that the department reviews your contracts before you execute them. If you need to change your project, reach out to us, let us know. If you need to adjust the budget because concrete costs 3 times more than it used to, and so we need to make adjustments, we are happy to work with you on that. Don't start work before construction drawings have been reviewed and approved by department staff. And make sure that you maintain a complete and accurate grant file. So what resources do you have? Us, the division. We want you to succeed. We want these projects to be successful, and we want to see wonderful things once you're finished. We want all those great photographs. So we're here to help you. Always you can read your grant award agreement, the AACH program guidelines. I will send those to you. And then this presentation, I put in the very beginning, in the chat, that a link to the recording, a copy of the slide deck is a PDF, a copy of the guidelines, and a link to the quiz will be sent as a follow-up. So as part of the first deliverable, there's a quiz for you to take, and you need to get 100 on it. And that will be part of your deliverable documentation for payment number 1. So you will get all those things in a follow-up email. Our contact information is here in the slide. Eric is the supervisor in DHR, but we also have Olivia And we also, oh, and Nicole is here now too. I didn't see her earlier. I apologize. And Alexa, whoever you're working with in DHR, contact them. Or if you're working directly with me, this is my phone number, my email. You've already seen it because I've talked to or emailed with all of you. And we're always happy to help. Okay, I'm gonna leave it on the contract screen. I know that was a lot. Let me see if there are questions. Would soil testing fall under ground disturbance? And can proposals for architectural and engineering services be issued and or received prior to the grant contract execution? So, I'm gonna ask someone in historical resources to answer the question about the ground disturbance.
Hi, everyone. This is Eric. That's a good question. I'd say it depends on the nature of the under the test. I'm not particularly familiar with soil tests as what the procedure for doing one of those entails. But the purpose of the clause is to protect any potential archaeological resources we don't know about at your location. So I'd say if it's minimally invasive, then I don't think it will be an issue. But once you start needing to, let's say, dig a trench to lay new plumbing, then we're going to have to start having that conversation.
Great, thank you, Eric. And then about the proposals for architectural and engineering services. So if you're already working on a contract with an architect or an engineer, as long as you have us look at it and approve it, you don't have to have the grant award agreement in place. But of course, you will want to make sure that you execute your grant award agreement as soon as you can. A lot of our grantees want to have that contract with an architect or an engineer, so that they have exact costs to put in their budget for their grant award agreement. So yes, just make sure we approve it first. And Jason wants to know, when will we receive our grant award agreements? So that really does depend on how quickly you get the updated scope of work and budget to us. So once you submit it to us, we will review it. If we have questions, we'll reach out. If what you provided is acceptable, we will send you the grant award agreement for signature. So it really just depends on how fast you get it to us, how quickly we can get it back to you. For projects with scopes that are beyond the grant criteria, do separate A&E proposal and construction costs be separated out line item and for the grant specific reimbursable? Okay, so Lance, if I'm understanding you correctly, your project is bigger than your grant award agreement. So what you will do is your budget and your scope of work for your grant award agreement will just be that portion of your A&E proposal or construction costs that is covered under the grant. It is helpful to have those separated out by the contractor, architect, engineer, so that we know specifically we have a $5 million project. The grant by the Department of State is covering these things. So yes, do provide that information so that we're able to parse that out when we're approving payments and looking at documentation and things like that. Anyone else? Question? Comments, concerns? Can you send me the grant specialist contact info for Smiley County? Jason, that's, I will send it to you. It's me. It's Terry Abstein, but I will send that to you. I can put it in the chat while we're waiting to see if anyone else has any questions. Okay, well, that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our next steps really are for you to take your quiz. When I send you the link, it probably won't be till tomorrow, because the recording has to process. But also, if you haven't already sent updated scope of work and budget, make sure you do that. And if you have specific questions about your project and how that fits into everything that I've covered, feel free to reach out, phone, email, and we're happy to help. All right, if there isn't anything else, we will call this meeting adjourned. Thank you everyone for being here. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.